is 1986 and you are at something very, very historical. This is a teleconference that is happening between 200 women between Soviet Union and USA. After decades of secrecy and hostility, both nations have a chance to finally see each other through the screen and talk directly. Absolutely no topic is off limits. Women ask freely about nuclear weapons, about family life, and even censorship. And the discussion gets very, very heated. Until there is one American woman that asks about commercials. Specifically, that everything is being sexualized in the USA, including the commercials, and whether Soviet Union has such commercials. There is a reply from the Soviet audience, and that is that there is no sex in the USSR, and we are strictly opposed to it.
Если у вас такая телереклама?
Секса у нас нет, и мы категорически против этого.
У нас есть, у нас нет рекламы.
Это ошибка.
There is a huge laughter, and then she finished somewhere in between saying that we don't have sex, but we have love. Despite the laugh and the ridiculous looks by some Soviet women, I think there was a lot of truth to it, and it became a meme before memes were there. The thing is that the irony is kind of massive, because 60 years ago, before she said those words, the Soviet Union had its own sexual revolution. A country that invented free love ended up requiring a marriage certificate just to book a hotel room. And this is the story of this video. And in order to explain this to you, how we got here, I have to explain to you from the very beginning, and that is the sexual revolution. In the very first years after the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks, the revolutionaries, didn't just want to change factories and laws and land ownership. They genuinely believed that they could redesign human relationships by itself. Alexandra Kollontai, which was someone that was the closest thing that the early Soviet Union had to a feminist theorist, she wrote about something called the winged eros. She imagined a world where the state would run the laundries, the state would run the kitchens, the nurseries, and even the schools, so that women were no longer chained to domestic work, which is aptly shown in this poster. And there was this infamous glass of water interpretation, which is sometimes attributed to Kollontai, wrongly attributed. It was this idea that sexual desire was a biological need that shouldn't carry guilt or ritual or any kind of obligation, that sex should be as easy, as natural as having a glass of water. In fact, the early Bolshevik government legalized abortion in 1920. They encouraged civil unions, and they almost tried to abolish weddings. And I mean, the civil unions had almost the same rights. Surprisingly, by the mid-1920s, you actually had nudist rallies marching with banners that were proclaiming "down with shame." And the anecdotes from that time are actually quite interesting. So this is what people said about that time in the newspapers. So recently, completely naked people, both men and women, appeared in Moscow wearing armbands that read "down with shame." They climbed onto trams which were stopped, and the public were quite outraged. It goes on to say that the older women crossed themselves their thought that apocalypse was here, and they asked the other passengers that in confusion that what is this? Are they going to force us to undress now? And all of this was happening way before any such kind of thing would be happening in the West. But the thing was that there was a bigger problem than startled babushkas. The social infrastructure that the Bolsheviks promised, for example, free childcare and communal cafeterias and functioning laundries, it never really materialized at scale. Despite the fact that they wanted to liberalize everything, they didn't have the infrastructure to carry out those reforms. And then women often carried the consequences. Abandonment was common. The local supporting Soviet structures had no mechanism to have child support. The state was supposed to help raise the child, but it was technically nowhere to be found. There were official reports that by 1923, half of the children born in Moscow had been conceived out of wedlock, and many of them were just abandoned. On top of that, you had, of course, sexual violence and STDs rampant. And then when Stalin consolidated power, entire culture flipped. The experiment with this sexual freedom became politically dangerous, and stability and population growth started to matter a lot more than these utopian theories. Divorce immediately became harder, abortion was banned again, and the tone of everyday life shifted very sharply. Even research related to sex was completely abandoned. For decades to come, sexuality and anything related to sex would be completely shunned by the Soviet culture and society. And considering this, it is no wonder that the Russian society became so hypocritical about sex. The next sexual revolution would only take place in the 1990s after the USSR was dissolved. But our story does not end here, because then came the war, the Great War, the event that more than anything shaped Soviet relationships. An entire generation of men just got wiped in the war. Women outnumbered men by such margins that competition for a suitable partner became very, very intense. In the 1940s and 50s, it was very common to find highly educated and accomplished women who were single or widowed, just marrying much older men due to just lack of choice. And the state response was just to encourage women to have children regardless of marriage. Unwed mother received stipends, and being a mother heroine, having many children was glorified. Dating in the late 1940s and early 1950s was less about romance and more about survival and necessity. The next revolution, the next important milestone, wasn't ideological. It was architectural. Khrushchev moved millions of families from overcrowded communal apartments into their own tiny flats. They were small, they were very cheaply built, and they were very poorly insulated. But they had something magical. You finally had a door, and that single feature reshaped how people met and talked and fell in love. For young people who had grown up stepping over neighbors in corridors in those like big communalkas, sharing bathrooms with 10 families, the ability to sit in a private room with somebody, just the two of you, it felt like a luxury beyond money. And then they finally also got a taste of what the world was actually like outside of the Soviet Union. In 1957, there was a World Festival of Youth that brought hundreds of foreigners into Moscow from across the world, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa. And for the first time, the Soviet youth saw blue jeans and jazz and Western flirting up close. By the early 1960s, the era of ideological extremes was finally ending, and we can finally see something akin to a golden period of Soviet relationships. This Brezhnev period is what many remember as the golden age of the Soviet courtship, because it was finally a generation that had seen some stability. So what exactly was Soviet courtship and relationships and dating was like? First thing was that it wasn't in any way like the Western form of dating that we are used to seeing. The factors that shaped the Soviet society shaped the courtship rituals in their own ways. For example, let's start with how people met. One of the very unique ways that young people met was at the voluntary compulsory camps that youth engaged in. For example, university students were regularly sent on summer work trips. They would harvest potatoes on collective farms. I mean, young people just thrown together in an unfamiliar place led to really, really strong bonds. Even the authorities saw this as a healthy interaction. Countless Soviet couples later said that they met while digging potatoes or beets or on a student construction brigade. Might not sound very romantic, but I mean, shared labor created a kind of camaraderie that often turned into love. And there was this, of course, classic student universities and dorms. I mean, dormitory life in Soviet colleges was co-ed. Of course, you don't have the same rooms, but you had the same building. So girls and boys shared the same buildings, but with different rooms. And it was very turbulent and social. Of course, young men and women from all over the country lived in close quarters. And you gotta know that Soviet Union was one of the biggest countries in the world at that time. They would organize kitchen parties and study groups and group outings, and dorm kitchens and hallways became sort of like impromptu dating hubs. One of the most fascinating things for me was finding out that libraries were actually considered an ideal place to meet your future partner. In fact, one of the most famous movies, Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears, the lady mentions that library is the best place to meet your potential love because it has some of the most educated men visiting, like doctors or writers or philosophers. So yeah, now that we know how they met, what did the dating process actually look like? So in many respects, it was similar to dating anywhere else, but the constraints, again, of Soviet life made it pretty unique. First thing was that there wasn't a culture of casual or serial dating. People just didn't typically date multiple people. As one person familiar with both cultures said, that once two people began seeing each other outside of a friend group and in public, it was automatically assumed that they were in a relationship. There was no dating around in the Soviet scene. And also, given the limited venues and resources, Soviet dating relied on very simple and very inexpensive activities. Few of them were like, for example, walks in the park. It was the quintessential Soviet date. Cities had many public parks and boulevards and scenic embankments. In fact, it was even considered a mark of a solid date if you were able to travel the whole walking ring of the park, which could be often tens of kilometers. And then, of course, there were movies and theater. Young couples would actually really want to go to the movies because they were cheap and they could find a little bit of privacy in the darkness in the back seats. And then, surprisingly, you could visit each other's homes. I mean, of course, you would not have much privacy over there. It was a chance to meet each other's families. And come over to my place often meant that you would be meeting the family at the same time. Many dates took place in somebody's living room under the eyes of parents or roommates. If the family was out or if the young person had their own room, they might get a little bit of alone time, but usually with the door open or the constant possibility of someone walking in. And this brings us full circle back to intimacy, part of relationships that the Soviet system made the hardest and tried the hardest to squash. First thing was that I already mentioned, that you had almost no privacy. In fact, there is a running joke that says that there is no word for privacy in Russian language. Even if you went to a hotel, meant that you had to give proof of your marriage. Even if you were newly married and your paperwork was in progress, you still couldn't get a hotel room until they could see that you are actually married, because it was noted down on your ID card, your passport ID. But again, like everything else in the Soviet Union, there was an inherent contradiction, because that hotels or places reserved for elite, the Communist Party functionaries, were above such constraints. They could do whatever they want in their personal life and nobody would bother them. The fun fact here is that it was only in 2019 that Uzbekistan, the former Soviet Republic, repealed the old Soviet decree so that unmarried couples could stay in hotels together. Secondly, sex education wasn't limited. It was almost eliminated. After the 1930s, schools completely avoided the topic entirely. Sex education as a field was completely dismantled. I mean, there were no alternative sources either. All kinds of sexually explicit material was, of course, illegal and could be confiscated, and you couldn't really find it. I mean, a young Soviet person could reach adulthood without ever seeing a realistic depiction of intimacy. As one woman puts it in this paper, she said that we were brought up as if sex didn't even exist, and that they feared the naked bodies and sex like fire. Do party members make babies wearing fur coats? Because nobody talked about sex, first experiences were actually quite anxious, and you were like ridden with guilt and anxiety. Late Soviet intimacy researchers found that the root for so many of sexual dysfunctions that plagued the society at that time weren't really physical at all. They came from fear and shame and the inability to communicate, because you really didn't have the awareness and the education on understanding what was happening. Men often associated intimacy with secrecy and guilt, and women often assumed that discomfort was normal because no one had ever explained consent or bodily autonomy to each other. I mean, couples really cared for each other, but you had almost no tools to build healthy closeness, something that is very, very natural for a human being. And then, of course, there is this topic of contraception. Condoms were poor quality and kept behind the counter. There are so many stories, like if you went to buy the condom, you had to whisper like euphemisms, and you had to endure the glare of the pharmacist, who would be like, yeah, what are you doing? The contraceptive pill was available from 70s onwards as it was imported from abroad, but officially it was very heavily discouraged, which meant that many Soviet women and couples were deeply suspicious of using them. So this lack of contraceptives and sexual education resulted in something almost unheard of before at all. After abortion was re-legalized in 1955, the Soviet Union saw some of the highest abortion numbers in the world, an estimated 6 to 7 million abortions annually in the 60s and 70s. By the late Soviet era, the average Soviet woman had 2 to 4 abortions over her lifetime, sometimes even more than 7. It wasn't, of course, a matter of preference, but it was the only thing that the Soviet system reliably provided. It wasn't unusual for a doctor to ask a patient, like almost casually, that is this your first or second this year, because the practice has become so normalized inside the healthcare system. And the thing is that for something so common, abortion was barely spoken about. Families avoided discussing it. Schools never acknowledged it. Media pretended it didn't exist, like sex, for example. And the state framed childbearing as a patriotic duty. So women had to carry the burden by themselves in hospital corridors and overcrowded clinics. Many remember the experiences as routine, something that you had to do in the middle of the week. But of course, it was very emotionally isolating. The procedure was free. There was no counseling, there was no emotional realization of the impact, there was no follow-up, there was no conversation about prevention, and no cultural space to process. Because physical intimacy was so constrained, emotional intimacy became incredibly deep. With no pornography, no sexual advertisement, and almost no private space, people poured their energy into long walks, into handwritten letters, into poems, into hours of conversation, and the slow build of anticipation. Many people actually describe Soviet courtship as emotionally rich but physically starved. It was awkward and limited and yet intensely sincere. If you crossed that line into intimacy with someone, it usually meant that you were ready for a future together. One of the things I like the most when I talk about Soviet Union is that when I talk about these granular problems about people, a lot of people come and say in comments that this is something that I see happening, and that is exactly what I want to do. I want to share problems that relate us to each other because we are more similar to each other than we realize, even if we are separated by time, by years, and by space, by entirely different cultures and entirely different systems. We still wanted the same things, and we tried to work around the systems that surround us. So yeah, in the end, I want to put out the question to you. What do you think? Do you think that the Soviet idea of just shunning the sex and putting everything in a box, do you think it works? Or do you think it can work? Because clearly it didn't. But on the other hand, do you think that freely exposing everything, that making everything rampant and exposing, do you think that can work? Because I don't think that can work either, because we have seen those things happening elsewhere in the Western world, and I don't think that experiment has worked. This is just my own personal opinion. So is there a line in between? Is there some place where the state has to intervene? Because the state does always intervene. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next one.